As you read Ian Fleming's novels, you might wonder, what are those planes that Bond flies in? And what airlines does he fly on? So we're going to find out today on PCZ TV. PCZ TV. We now think of Bond as quite the cosmopolitan jet-setter. But recall that Fleming wrote the Bond novels between 1953 and 1966, just as the post-war aviation boom started and as planes were transitioning from long-range flying boats to prop-driven aircraft to turboprops and to jets. So the planes and airlines described in his books are not ones commonly encountered today, and they differ quite a lot from the cinematic Bond. So let's put these books in context and discover just what Bond was on. Starting in 1953's Casino Royale, and not much of a start as there are no planes mentioned. Awkward. Thankfully, 1954's Live and Let Die, he flies on a BOAC Stratocruiser, and thus begins his literary love affair with this airline and this plane. James Bond was treated like royalty. Well, I should hope so, because in today's dollars, this airfare is around $5,000 for a ticket. But let's look at the Stratocruiser. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was a long-range airliner developed from the C-97 Strato Freighter military transport, which itself is a derivative of the B-29 Super Fortress. Oh, you may recall the B-29 from its most infamous mission. Anyway, the Stratocruiser's first flight was in 1947. Its design features included passenger decks and a pressurized cabin. It could carry up to 100 passengers on the main deck, plus 14 in the lower deck lounge. But its reliability was poor, mainly due to problems with the 428-cylinder Pratt and Whitney R4360 Wasp major radial engines. These things are beasts. They're 4,360 cubic inch, that's 71.5 liters each. It was the largest displacement aviation piston engine to be mass-produced in the US, and at 4,300 horsepower, it was also the most powerful. Note that this engine also powered many of the last generation of large piston aircraft before turbojets and jets, such as the massive B-36 and the Goodyear FG2 Super Corsair. Now, only 55 Stratocruisers were built for the airlines, and none remain in existence today. Next up is Moonraker, and again, no planes. This is not going well so far. But in 1956, diamonds are forever, and Bond flies to America again on a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser with BOAC Monarch Flight 505 from London to New York, with a stopover at Shannon Airport in Ireland, where he stops off for an Irish coffee. And for an anorak view of his Irish whiskies, see this video. Oh, speaking of Flight 505, it's a flight number that didn't actually exist in the day. Now, AJB007's website did a deep dive into the flight number and concluded it was in fact made up. And this won't be the first time for Ian to do so, which is interesting, that given he usually uses actual items for authenticity in his novels. We'll talk more about this later. Anyway, speaking of later, Bond and Tiffany return to New York from LA, where they fly TWA via Chicago. Again with a made-up flight number, but they are flying in the correct plane for TWA, the Lockheed Super Constellation. or as he called it, the new Super G. Now, Transworld Airlines, under the direction of Howard Hughes, first coined the phrase Super G for the Lockheed L-1049G Super Constellation, which began flying in 1954. The flight from LA to New York went through Chicago, as mentioned, and took just 10 hours. Getting into LaGuardia at 8 on a Saturday morning is a red-eye. So let's look at the Constellation whose production began in 1943. Now, the Connie that Ian referred to is the 1049G, which is a stretched version with an up-engined Wright R3350 972-TC18DA-3 engine. Whew. It's a twin-row, 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine with a displacement of 3,350 cubic inches, that's 55 liters almost, and horsepower in the range of 3,400. Note that it featured a turbo compound radial engine. Turbo compound? Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I've not heard of that term before, so I had to look it up. Turbo compound was a feature that involved power recovery turbines that captured the exhaust gas energy and converted it into additional power, feeding it back to the crankshaft through a fluid coupling. So it's different from a turbocharger or a turboprop, and I had never heard of this before. This is interesting. Anyway, back to the Connie. I mean, what a gorgeous aircraft. Seriously, look at this lady. The Super G was, like the Stratocruiser, built for comfort and style in the area, but let's face it, the Connie was gorgeous, the Stratocruiser was portly. Around 850 Constellations of all makes were made, with at least one Super Constellation still flying in Australia, and there are approximately 5 other Constellation airframes preserved globally. Moving on to 1957's From Russia with Love, we find out that Red Grant has to dodge some MiG-17s on the way to his plane. The MiG-17 was, of course, one of the most famous MiG fighters that entered service in 1952 and first saw combat in the Suez Crisis around the time this book was being written. Over 10,500 of these planes were made and flown by various Soviet puppet states, with the prettiest camo schemes probably that of the North Vietnamese. Although, being American, I sort of like this view of the MiG-17 better. It is from a certain era, if you know what I mean. Oh, by the way, some are still in service, of course, with the North Korean Air Force. Anyway, Mr. Grant himself flies in a 2-engined Ilyushin 12 with registration V-BO, and I can't say Ilyushin, so I'm just going to fake it from this point on. The IL-12 was introduced in 1947 and was a conventional radial 2-engine design, essentially to replace the Lend-Lease Supply DC-3s. Depending on configuration, it could carry up to 32 passengers. It was powered by 2 Shvetsov ASh-82FN radial engines rated at 1,850 horsepower each. A total of 663 IL-12s were manufactured, and there were approximately 4 still left in museum. I'm surprised the North Koreans aren't still flying them, actually.
You're a funny guy, Sully. I like you. That's why I'm going to kill you last.
Meanwhile, back to Bond. He jumps in BEA Flight 130, which actually is a correct flight number, that goes to Rome and then Athens and ends in Istanbul, all in a Vickers Viscount. Most telling, though, is that Bond shares his thoughts on the plane when he talks about the turbojet, or turboprop as we call it, experience. Now, it must have made a big impression on Fleming to describe the turboprop, because he put it in such detail in the novel. So let's look at the muse of this prose, the Vickers Viscount. It's a British medium-range turboprop airplane, first flown in 1948, with regular passenger flights launched by BEA in 1953 for the world's first scheduled turboprop airline service. Again, depending on configuration, it could carry up to 75 passengers. All Viscounts were powered by the Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop, initially at 800 horsepower, then 1,000 horsepower for later models. So a quick aside on turboprops. This engine is a gas turbine engine similar to a jet, but most of the engine's power turns a propeller instead of producing jet exhausts for propulsion. Makes it very fuel efficient for shorter flights and slower speeds, like regional travel or smaller airports. In fact, turboprops were still used in the US as late as 2018, after which they were more or less phased out in favor of newer, more efficient jet engine aircraft. Oh yes, back to the Viscount. Of the 445 built, an amazing 28 or so still exist and are on display. And now to the last plane in the novel, we're back to our old friend, the BOAC Stratocruiser. And again, a made-up flight number. So within the same novel, we see a correct flight number for BEA, but a made-up one for BOAC. I don't get it.
Why?
Next on deck is 1958's Dr. No, where Bond is flown to Jamaica in a Super Constellation. Now, we spoke about this plane earlier with TWA and Diamonds Are Forever, but Bond now is flying on a BOAC Super Constellation. But what confuses me is that looking at the BOAC flight schedules of the era, it appears that they only flew Stratocruisers from the UK to the islands, and the Connies were on the New York routes.
I don't get this at all. I thought Low Pan...
Shut up, Mr. Burton. You are not brought upon this world to get it.
As if Ian isn't giving us enough of a headache in this novel, the next plane he discusses is way vague. Now, Bond is told that some Autobahn representative died in a plane crash on Dr. No's island in a privately owned Beechcraft model unknown. In this era with Beechcraft, it could have been anything from the very classic Staggerwing to the Model 18 or the Bonanza. I don't know. Ian wasn't specific. Your guess is as good as mine. If you feel you know, then let me know in the comments below. Also mentioned in the novel is that Dr. No has a Grumman amphibian. And you guessed it, like the Beechcraft, this is super vague, because it could refer to the Grumman Goose, a small twin-engine seaplane popularized in World War II, and in the TV show Tales of the Golden Monkey, or because it was flown by Jimmy Buffett. A total of 345 were built, with many flying to this day. But it might also be one of the other Grumman amphibians of the era, like the Widgeon, of which 3,000 were built, or the Mallard, like 60 were built, or the much bigger Albatross, around 460 were built. Again, Ian was not specific beyond the manufacturer's name. I don't know. What do you think? Ian, you're killing me.
Shut up! You're killing me, Smalls.
Next up, 1959's Goldfinger. Bond is on a Transamerica flight TR-618 Miami to New York, which gets delayed, but no specific plane is mentioned. And here's where Ian really starts to deviate from reality, if that's possible. You see, the flight number obviously is totally fictional, but even more than that, Transamerica Airlines didn't exist in this era. It flew under a different name, Trans International Airline. So Ian is deviating more and more from reality, not just flight numbers, but made-up airlines. Don't know why. But as if to confuse us even more, he swears back into reality when he has Bond send a crate on BOAC Britannia. This was actually a service offered by BOAC, and it was on the Britannia. So the Bristol Britannia, it's a very attractive 4-engine long-range turboprop aircraft. They were fitted with the Bristol Proteus engine. Proteus? I think that's said that right. which was the first mass-produced gas turbine from Bristol, and it delivered just over 4,000 horsepower. Production began in 1952, but introduction was delayed until 1957 due to engine issues and extreme caution after the de Havilland Comet disasters. Now, only 85 were ever built. Meant they were a little late to the party as jets were being introduced at the same time. Only about 3 of these airframes remain today. And then Ian tells us about, quote, the big jaws of the Bristol Freighter. No, not those jaws. Those jaws. The Bristol Freighter, as the name implies, is a cargo plane, and the nefarious Goldfinger moves his car to the continent using one of these planes. It's a British twin-engine aircraft designed and built by Bristol as both a freighter and an airliner. Now, the freighter was developed during the Second World War when they wanted a cargo aircraft to carry everything in its brother, including a 3-ton truck. But it was too late for World War II, as its first flight was in December of 1945. It used the Bristol Hercules engine, a 14-cylinder, 2-row radial aircraft engine whose production began in actually 1939. And the variant used for this plane was almost 200 horsepower. Now, these engines powered many British aircraft in World War II. 214 of these freighters were made, with around 11 remaining on display. And next up, we're back with Bond again on the Stratocruiser and BOAC Monarch Flight number 510 to Gander in London, call sign GALGY. Well, this would come as no surprise to the viewer, but the registration number is correct for a British civilian aircraft. However, I could find no record of it actually being applied to a BOAC aircraft. Oh, the flight number, you ask? Well, that's made up.
Yes.
Okay, now sit down, brace yourself with a stiff drink, because we're going to dive into Thunderball. An aircraft gets hijacked is a Villiers Vindicator, O/NBR, from number 5 RAF Experimental Squadron, based at Bascombe Down. So we have to break this down. 1, there is no manufacturer as Villiers, or a plane called the Vindicator bomber that's nuclear capable. Now, there was a Vindicator bomber, but it was made by the American firm Vought starting in 1937. It was quickly removed from frontline service and retired in 1945.
Weird.
Okay, this is too much for me. So I asked Grok, why does Fleming make up all these aircraft and aircraft flight numbers? He had 2 thoughts. One is that it was a plot device flexibility, so he could give all sorts of capabilities to the aircraft. You didn't have to worry about details. And secondly, national security concerns that maybe using real flights and numbers were sensitive, and by inventing all these things he could just bypass all of that. Of course, the irony is that in the movie they used an Avro Vulcan, one of the British V bombers of the day. And in a Flight of Fancy, Mateline.com created a version of this fictional aircraft, which to me looks like right out of a Jerry Anderson show, but what do I know? Anyway, back to the continuing theme of literary devices. There is no number 5 experimental squadron. There is a test and evaluation squadron, and I'm just guessing he's in full fiction writer mode here. Oh, another Interac tidbit, the plane registration numbers. Now, just as we all know the license plate number of James Bond's DB5, planes have the equivalent registration number. And again, Ian takes pain to share these. In the case of the Vindicator, it has a O/NBR, Oscar/November Bravo Romeo, plane registration. But British military aircraft generally use Z to start their registration numbers. And the British civilian planes use a G in George. Just more Fleming fantasy? Okay, maybe I'm too deep in the weeds.
What, are you retarded?
Next up in the novel, Bond is flying around in the little Grumman amphibian. And we're back to this again, just like Dr. No. We get no more details of the plane except the registration number.
No! God, please, no!
N/AKOI. Again, it's interesting that Ian takes the time to add these details, but they're so wrong. An N indicates it's a U.S. plane registration, which it's entirely possible to fly there from the U.S., but U.S. N numbers can have up to 5 characters, but cannot contain the letters I or O, and don't use slashes. Anyway, let's talk about our old friend Giuseppe Petacci. During World War II, Giuseppe had been a co-pilot of a Focke-Wulf 200. Now, the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor is an all-metal, 4-engine monoplane designed and produced by the German aircraft manufacturer Focke-Wulf, or is it Focke-Wulf? I don't know. It was initially designed as a passenger aircraft. And fun fact, it was the first heavier-than aircraft to fly nonstop between Berlin and New York City, which is around 4,000 miles. They did this in 1938, and it took 24 hours. That's one long flight. Anyway, it was powered by 4 Brahmo 323R2 9-cylinder, single-row, air-cooled piston engines, making a little over 1,000 horsepower each. It was also the personal aircraft of Mr. Hitler.
Whoa!
Of the 276 made, only one exists today. And we move on into 1962 and The Spy Who Loved Me. It has nothing. Which leads us right into 1963 and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where Bond is flying on Swissair Flight 110, to which by now no one should be surprised because there was no Flight 110.
Oh, no. Anyway, last week...
Bond is flying on the Sud Aviation SE-210 Caravelle, which is our first French aircraft, and also the first jet that Bond flies on. It's a rear-engine, narrow-body jet airliner with the engines in the back, which, by the way, Ian calls out in the novel. Of course, Bond is in the front, first class. It was developed in the 1950s, first flight in 1955, and it actually entered service in 1959, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojet engines. These were prolific engines of the time, powering everything from the commercial airliners to Canberra jet bomber to the electric Lightning fighter. 282 were built and produced. Production ended in 1972 and retired from service in 2005, and there are approximately 20 airframes remaining on display. And now we see our first helicopter, because Bond is beside a, quote, bright orange Alouette helicopter. So let's take a look at the helicopter. The Swiss purchased their first Aérospatiale Alouette II in 1957. It was powered by a single Turbomeca Artouste II turboshaft engine capable of generating a maximum output of 400 horsepower, and I'm sure I said that name wrong. Variants of the helicopter were manufactured from 1956 to 1975, with more than 1,300 made, and still many used on this day. The next helicopter mentioned in the novel is a bit vague. It was a helicopter stolen from the French army.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
Well, given it's a French army helicopter, I'm gonna go with the Alouette again. Also mentioned is a French-made Mirage fighter flown by the Swiss. Here we have a wee bit of an issue, and while the Mirage fighter did exist in this time, the Swiss didn't acquire any Mirage fighters until 1967, 4 years after the book was written. In this era, the Swiss Air Force were flying de Havilland Venom or de Havilland Viper fighters. These are first-generation jet fighters, maybe not as sexy as Mirage, And I'd almost label them as retro because they have a front cockpit and a rear engine and a twin tail. In fact, de Havilland, the manufacturer of these planes, also made the DH-2 of World War I, which had the same engine configuration. Now, given how English these planes are, I'm surprised Fleming went full French with his aviation influences in this novel. And so we move on to 1964 and You Only Live Twice, and our first Douglas aircraft, the DC-8. It was one of the early long-range narrow-body jetliners and produced actually locally to me here in the South Bay in Long Beach. JAL at this time flew the Series 30, which used a Pratt and Whitney JT4A-9 engine. The DC-8 was produced until 1972 with 556 aircraft built, and actually some are still being used in active service today, albeit up-engined and whatnot. Next up, Tiger Tanaka starts talking about his time in the kamikaze. He obviously never got assigned a combat mission, but he does talk about a specific plane. He called it the Baku, a small plane made mostly of wood. Well, Ian was close. Oh, what Tiger is actually referring to is the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka meaning cherry blossom. It was known as the Baka bomber by the Allies, Baka meaning foolish or stupid, not Baku. Now, this aircraft was a purpose-built, rocket-powered, human-guided kamikaze aircraft with a 2,600-pound warhead. It was powered by 3 Type 4 Mark I Model 20 solid propellant rocket motors with 588 pounds each, producing a maximum speed of 400 miles an hour. And a few corrections to Ian. It wasn't carried below a fighter bomber. The greatest weakness was it was carried to the area by slow, lumbering Betty bombers. And given that its range was only 23 miles, the solution to this significant problem to the Allies was simply to shoot down the bombers before they deployed the aircraft. In any case, of the 300 Oka available for the Okinawan campaign, 74 actually undertook operations, of which 56 were either destroyed with their parent aircraft or in making attacks. And there's a lot of debate if any actually crashed into an American vessel. Fortunately, the war ended before they could be deployed from the Japanese mainland on the Allied invasion fleets. Now, the Japanese were hoarding their planes for kamikaze attacks and planning for launching these aircraft from caves and ramps, which would have caused complete and utter devastation. Glad it never happened. There are about 16 remaining examples, not including replicas, on display in museums globally, with 2 actually located in Southern California. The history of the kamikaze is a sad and tragic one for all involved. Watch this NHK video. And now we're up to 1965's The Man with the Golden Gun. This is the last of the Fleming novels, and here we bring in another airline, British West Indies Airline. Now, Bond's at the Kingston International Airport, and from his descriptions, it's a less than spectacular place to spend a few hours. British West Indies Airlines, well, since it was a short flight, I'm going to guess the plane was a Vickers Viscount. We talked about it earlier because it was adopted by BWIA in 1955. Now we have the posthumously published Octopussy and the Living Daylights. 1962, The Living Daylights mention is made of a BEA flight from Hanover to Berlin. Giving the short hop, giving their fleet, I'm going to go with the venerable Vickers Viscount again, which BEA, again, started flying in 1953. And the last is 007 in New York. And Bond ends the way he starts, on a BOAC Monarch Flight Stratocruiser. So there you go. These are the planes from the novels. So next time you read the book, you'll know what Bond was on. If you have been, I thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And more importantly, read my disclaimers. Bye!